Some endings are obvious. Someone says goodbye, you finish the last page of a book, you walk out of your final exam, and your mind quietly understands it's over. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes a friendship doesn't end with an argument. It simply becomes quieter. The messages become less frequent. Plans stop happening. Until one day, you realize you haven't spoken in months. You're left with questions. Did I misunderstand everything? Could I have done something differently? Was any of it even real? These questions don't always stay in the past. They follow you into ordinary moments. You're making breakfast, and suddenly you're replaying a conversation from 2 years ago. You're driving somewhere familiar, and your mind quietly returns to the same unanswered question. As though this time, somehow, it might discover the missing piece it overlooked before. It's exhausting, not because the memory itself is so heavy, but because your mind keeps treating it like an unfinished task. Maybe you've noticed that too. Some experiences seem to settle naturally, while others simply refuse to let go. At first, it feels like what you're missing is an explanation. One final conversation, one honest answer, or even just one sentence that finally makes everything make sense. We even have a word for that feeling. Closure. We tell ourselves, once I get closure, I'll be able to move on. But what if that's not actually what we're searching for? What if the thing we call closure is actually certainty? The two sound similar, but they aren't the same. Closure is emotional. It's the feeling that something has been resolved, that you've made peace with what happened and no longer need to carry it with you. Certainty is different. Certainty is simply knowing. Knowing what happened, why it happened, or where you stand. It doesn't promise comfort. It only removes the unknown. That's an important distinction because we often assume one automatically leads to the other. It doesn't. Imagine someone ends a relationship and sits down with you for one final conversation. They answer your questions honestly. They explain why they made their decision. They don't leave you guessing or wondering if there was someone else, whether you misunderstood them or whether they might suddenly come back next month. You now have certainty. You know what happened, but that doesn't mean you found closure. You can still grieve. You can still miss them. You can still wish things had turned out differently. Understanding the ending doesn't erase the pain. It simply gives the pain somewhere solid to stand. Now consider the opposite. Imagine a relationship that slowly fades without explanation. Messages become less frequent. Plans are canceled. Eventually, the silence becomes so normal that you stop expecting a reply, yet no one ever tells you what changed. Or imagine going through several rounds of interviews for a job you desperately wanted. The final meeting seems to go well. They smile, shake your hand, and say, "We'll be in touch." Then, nothing. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. You don't know whether they chose someone else, whether the position was canceled, or whether your application was simply forgotten. In both of those situations, the pain is mixed with something else. Uncertainty. Your mind has nothing definite to hold on to. So it begins creating possibilities. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they lost your number. Maybe you should send one more message. Maybe the answer is still coming. Maybe there was something you missed. That's the burden of uncertainty. Not simply that you don't know, but that your mind can't stop trying to know. Why? Why is the mind so unwilling to leave an unanswered question alone? Why does it keep returning to the same memory, the same conversation, or the same moment, even years later? It can almost feel as though your brain is working against you. But it isn't. In fact, it's doing its job. Your brain is, first and foremost, a prediction machine. Every single moment of every single day, it's running countless calculations. It's scanning your environment, your relationships, even your own thoughts, constantly asking one fundamental question: what happens next? That isn't a philosophical question. It's a survival question. For most of human history, being able to anticipate what came next meant the difference between safety and danger. The more accurately your brain could recognize patterns, learn from experience, and anticipate what was likely to happen next, the better your chances of staying alive were. That system never disappeared. Today, your brain uses the same ability to navigate conversations, relationships, careers, and everyday decisions. It compares the present with the past, looking for familiar patterns so it can prepare for what's likely to come. When the pattern makes sense, everything runs smoothly. Your brain updates its understanding of the world, files the experience away, and moves on. But when the pattern breaks, like when someone leaves without an explanation, or when an opportunity disappears without a reason, or even when a story has no ending, your brain can't easily update its understanding of what happened. So it keeps the question open. From the brain's perspective, an unanswered question is still useful because the answer could change how it understands the world. If you eventually discover why that friendship ended, your brain learns something about relationships. If you understand why you didn't get the job, it learns something it can use the next time. Overall, understanding why something happened simply helps the brain prepare for similar situations in the future. That's why unanswered experiences keep pulling at your attention. Your brain isn't replaying the past because it's refusing to move on. It's replaying the past because it's still looking for information that might help it make better predictions about the future. But here's the problem. Your brain has no way of knowing whether the missing information still exists. It doesn't know whether you'll receive an explanation tomorrow, next month, or 5 years from now. As far as it's concerned, the answer could still be out there. So it keeps looking, not with your eyes, but with your attention. A familiar place reminds you of them. A certain song brings the memory back. Someone says a single sentence, and suddenly you're replaying a conversation you thought you'd forgotten. To you, it feels random, but to your brain, it's another opportunity. Maybe this time we'll understand what happened. Maybe this memory contains something we missed before. Maybe now the story will finally make sense. And every time it searches, it hopes for the same thing: certainty. But life doesn't always cooperate. Some questions are never answered. Some people never explain themselves. Some relationships end with silence instead of words. Some opportunities disappear without a reason you'll ever know. And grief? Grief asks questions that no conversation can answer. At some point, whether we like it or not, we reach a difficult truth. The certainty we've been waiting for may never arrive. And that's where many of us get stuck. We unknowingly put our lives on hold, waiting for a certainty that may never come. We tell ourselves, once I understand why they left, then I'll move on. Once I know what really happened, then I'll finally have peace. It sounds reasonable. In fact, it sounds almost impossible to argue with. After all, who wouldn't want answers? Who wouldn't want the missing pieces? The desire itself isn't the problem. In many situations, the answers would genuinely help. They could bring clarity. They could even prevent you from making the same mistake again. There's nothing wrong with hoping for them. The danger begins when you quietly turn those answers into a condition. When I know, then I'll move forward. When they explain themselves, then I'll let go. When everything finally makes sense, then I'll allow myself to begin again. Without realizing it, you've placed your future in the hands of something you don't control. And that's an impossible bargain to make with life, because life has never promised that every question will receive an answer. Some people never explain why they changed, and some opportunities disappear without revealing what happened behind the scenes. Sometimes the only thing you're left with is the fact that it happened. Nothing more. That feels deeply unfair. But it isn't. Because life isn't withholding answers because you've failed some invisible test. Sometimes there simply isn't another conversation waiting around the corner. Sometimes there isn't another email. Sometimes the person who could have explained everything has already moved on. Or perhaps they never fully understood their own reasons to begin with. Waiting won't change that, which means the question eventually changes. It is no longer, how do I find the answer? It becomes, how do I live if the answer never comes? That is a much more difficult question, but it's also the one that begins opening the door to peace. Because for the first time, your attention shifts. Up until now, every question you've asked has been directed at the past and to someone else. Why did this happen? What did I miss? Will I ever know the truth? Those questions all have one thing in common. Their answers depend on something outside you, another person's honesty, another conversation, or another explanation. But the question, how do I live if the answer never comes, is different. It's the first question whose answer belongs entirely to you. No one else can answer it for you, and no one else can prevent you from answering it either. That's why it begins opening the door to peace. Because your future is no longer waiting for someone else's explanation. It's waiting for your next decision. The next decision isn't to forget. It also isn't to convince yourself that what happened didn't matter. And it isn't to force yourself to stop wondering. It's much simpler than that. It's deciding that you no longer need complete certainty before you're willing to keep living. That's a difficult decision because your brain will continue asking for more information. It will continue offering new possibilities. Maybe they meant this. Maybe I overlooked something. Maybe if I think about it one more time, it'll finally make sense. Sometimes those thoughts will still appear, but you don't have to follow every one of them. You can notice the question, acknowledge that you don't have the answer, and still choose what you're going to do next. That is what moving forward really looks like. Not the absence of unanswered questions, but the willingness to keep living despite them. Because life isn't lived after every mystery has been solved. It's lived while some of those mysteries remain. Every life contains unfinished stories, conversations that never happened, questions that were never answered, or even dreams that ended without an explanation. The goal isn't to erase those stories. It's to stop waiting for them to be completed before allowing yourself to keep living. Because life doesn't pause while you're searching for certainty. It keeps moving. And one day, if you're not careful, you realize you've spent years waiting for an answer that was never coming, while the rest of your life quietly unfolded without you. Maybe that's the real cost of chasing certainty. Not that you never find every answer, but that you postpone living until you do. The truth is, some questions will remain unanswered. Not because you didn't search hard enough, but because life doesn't always provide complete explanations. And perhaps peace begins the moment you stop asking life to be certain and start accepting that uncertainty doesn't have to stop you from living a meaningful life.